ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Bruges Group event. May I just begin by conveying the sad news of the death of Professor Ken Minogue. Ken Minogue was a great intellectual, a great conservative. He's a former chairman of the Bruges Group, and he helped to found the Bruges Group some 20-odd years ago. Some of you will remember his last appearance here. I think it could only probably have been about 18 months ago. And he came to speak, and unfortunately the other speaker we'd booked for the evening didn't show. And Ken gave a bravado performance. He gave a fascinating speech, intellectually totally coherent. And having given a speech that lasted about half an hour, he then took questions for an hour and a half. He really was. He was a great man. Some of you may have seen the excellent obituary in the Daily Telegraph, but we shall miss him greatly. In fact, I had booked him for our November conference, and he was very keen to come along and speak and give us some of his words of wisdom. So I hope Ken Minogue will stay in the memories of all of us for what he did for this great cause. Now, Lord Tebbit is as ever fulfilling his duties, and he has a vote in the House of Commons. So he should be along shortly. Lords. Some may say that he would be a more effective performance still in the House of Commons than many members of that House. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Bruges Group meeting, which will provide a unique insight into Margaret Thatcher and the Thatcher years. We have two speakers that were amongst her closest confidants. One a cabinet colleague, and the other an advisor. May I firstly introduce Robin Harris. Robin began work for the Conservative Research Department in 1978. And from 1981 to 1983, he was Special Advisor to the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Nicholas Ridley. Then from 1983 to 1985, he was Special Advisor to the Home Secretary, Leon Britton. From 1985 to 1989, he was Director of the Conservative Research Department. And I believe he may even have given David Cameron his first job. I'm sure our Prime Minister today is an excellent researcher. And there's always been that rumour that David Cameron's application to join Central Office was enhanced by a telephone call from someone at Buckingham Palace. From 1989 to 1990, Robin was a member of the Prime Minister's Policy Unit. When Margaret Thatcher left Downing Street, so did he, going on to assist her with books and speeches, serving as her advisor for 13 years until 2003, since when he has been an acclaimed author of several histories and biographies. Most recently, these have included The Conservatives, A History, and Not for Turning, The Life of Margaret Thatcher. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Robin Harris.
Too much sound. There we are. I have to speak quietly. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In the absence of Lord Tebbit, the giants being absent, the pygmies have appeared on the stage. Also, spilled quite a lot of water, but then we'll begin. Funerals are not very pleasant events, but during Mrs. Thatcher's grand funeral in St. Paul's, there was a moment which was, for me, quite surprising. Because you're looking, obviously, at the high altar, you can't really see what's going on right in the back. But clearly, at some point, the great doors opened because you could hear suddenly very clearly that the gun carriage, I suppose it was, had arrived. You could hear the sergeant majors drilling their troops and screaming and shouting as sergeant majors do. And then there was another noise. There was a very, what can I say, a very loud chorus of human noise. And I say it in that odd way because I didn't know whether this was jeering or cheering. The ambiguity between the two words is entirely appropriate. Because I didn't know which. I mean, if you had read all of the write-up before the funeral, and you had listened and watched the BBC, you would expect that it would be jeering. But it wasn't. It was sort of cheering. And that was a very fine moment, I think. It was a very fine moment, because I'm not one of those who believes that vox populi is vox dei, but vox populi certainly knows a thing or two, and very much more than the BBC about the nation's opinions. And this was indeed confirmed by a very interesting poll that was done by the Sun newspaper just after Mrs. Thatcher's death. And people were asked who was the greatest post-war Prime Minister. And Mrs. Thatcher came out on top. And she was acclaimed and supported by 28%, and she beat Churchill, which you would be most surprised at, got 24%. Blair, I'm most surprised at, got even 10%. And as they say, right at the end, there was somebody else, our present Prime Minister, who, as they say, with British entries into the Eurovision Song Contest, got nul point. But the other questions also elicited interesting answers, I think, and they did show that really people had had a chance to reflect upon Mrs. Thatcher's legacy, and at some depth. So they were asked whether the country was economically better off as a result of her, and yes, they thought the country was better off economically. Was the country more respected in the world? And there overwhelmingly 60% thought that it was indeed more respected. Was society more or less equal? Well, people thought it was less equal, and that might be true, and it wouldn't have bothered Mrs. Thatcher tuppence. It would bother me tuppence, because the cost of freedom is some degree of inequality. Because the only way that you get equality is by government planning of society. And as Keith Joseph said in a famous book on the subject, you have to choose between liberty and equality, and it is much better to go for liberty, because at least then you get some degree of opportunity. And they were also asked whether society was more or less free, and they said it was more free. And it was interesting that the support for her was large, and larger than the hostility to her among every class and in every age group and in every part of the country except Scotland. And well, the Scots just don't like us very much. Some of the Scots don't like us very much. But anyway, the point was that this was a really an overwhelming endorsement of Mrs. Thatcher by people who, some of whom had lived under her, but all of whom had thought about the consequences of what the world would be like and what Britain would be like if there had been no Margaret Thatcher. Well, on a more personal note, I got to know her, I suppose really in the early 80s a bit. The way that you generally got to know Mrs. Thatcher was by having an argument. And we had an argument, it was quite a benevolent argument, and she liked what she heard, so that was all right. And then there were several more encounters like that, and then in 1985, as Baroness said, I became director of the research department. She had what one might call an open opportunities view of such appointments, because the chairman of the day, Gunner, said that he wanted to have, this should be advertised for all sorts of people, anybody could apply. And so Mrs. Thatcher said, that's fine, as long as Robin gets the job. So Robin did get the job. And from then on, I was helping her with her speeches and dealing with some difficult situations. And from 1985, I was indeed working for Lord Tebbit, who has joined us. So, well, those were happy years, most of them anyway. And then things became a bit less happy, really. 1989, difficulties, 1990, the defenestration. And so that really is my... And then, of course, I stayed with Mrs. Thatcher as an advisor, as a draftsman, and in the end, I like to think as a friend, up to the end. And those remarks are relevant for two reasons. First of all, because we can only speak of what we know. And I suppose that I knew Mrs. Thatcher in the last years of her time in power, mainly, and also afterwards. And so consequently, if you were tempted to read the book that I've written about her, you'll find that there is what some might consider a disproportionate concentration on the time after about 1985, but that's simply because it is largely a character study, and I was in a position to study her character for those years rather than the early years. Though there are things about the early years too. And in the remarks that I want to make, I do indeed want to deal first with her character, and then I want to say something about her downfall and the consequences thereof, and finally to make some sort of assessment of her legacy. Well, character. Mrs. Thatcher thought that character matters. She didn't think that people could just go into politics and pick it up as they go along and act in a merely pragmatic manner, learn the techniques, a bit of on-the-job training, look at the opinion polls, and that they would therefore be okay at dealing with the big decisions. She thought that character mattered, and she thought actually that the virtues mattered. Her character itself, I would say, although there were simple and clear elements to it, was quite complex because she had strengths, she had weaknesses. The strengths were much more important than the weaknesses, but we never quite knew which was going to come out on top at any particular moment. I'll give you an example. The question of judgment. I think that Mrs. Thatcher had enormously good political judgment about large matters. And I think also she was extremely shrewd about tactics most of the time. For example, in dealing with the trade unions that Norman Tebbit was crucial in dealing with. But also other things like balancing diplomacy and military action during the Falklands campaign. This required a great deal of shrewdness and common sense. And Mrs. Thatcher used to say that women had more common sense than men. This may well be true. I'm in a position to confirm or deny, you're going to do it. And but she certainly did have a lot of common sense. Her judgment failed sometimes about people, and I think that was true probably right at the end of her time in government. But this judgment, incidentally, sometimes she's blamed for hubris or this, that, and the other. This is not justified. In fact, I think that she believed that people were better than they were. She thought they were more honest than they were. She thought that if they'd been committed to her in good times, they were likely also to be committed to her in bad times. But of course, we'll learn differently. Well, traditionally, we used to speak about the cardinal virtues, which I can assure you have nothing to do with whether cardinals are virtuous or not. Virtuous or not, some are, but many aren't. But anyway, the cardinal virtues are, of course, those hinge virtues on which character is built. And they are prudence, common sense, and I've said something about that. Temperance isn't really about whether one likes to drink or not. It's actually a matter as to whether one is able to discipline oneself, one's mind, and one's body for some great task. And she had enormous strengths in that regard. She worked and worked and worked. And she didn't just work in a sort of mechanical way, she worked in a thoughtful and imaginative way. She listened to advice, of course, people who give advice and then they find the advice isn't taken, so that somebody hasn't listened to it. It's just that somebody didn't want to take their advice, but she did actually listen to advice. And she worked very hard, and she worked not just for herself. I think this is really very important to think about. She did not just work for herself. She thought that she was accountable for what she did because she had power. And she didn't think she was just accountable to the Conservative Party or the Cabinet or even the Parliamentary Party. She thought she was accountable to the nation, in a sense. She really worried about doing the right thing. She would spend hours thinking about what the right thing was to do in a difficult situation, not just what the easy or the popular thing was. And then the third of these cardinal virtues is justice. Now, justice is a funny term, often misused, but there are two aspects that I'd like to draw attention to. One is honesty. She was a person of absolute integrity. Like everybody else, every now and again, she didn't tell the whole truth. And sometimes she even sort of hoped to get by without, at least with hoping you would think this or that and the other. But when she did tell small lies, she was an extremely bad liar. And that is the proof of a really honest person. She was extremely honest. She had absolute integrity. And she was also fair. Now, of course, the left cannot begin to believe that this is so, because they think that fairness and justice are simply about ensuring that nobody suffers and nobody is poor and basically that everybody is equal. But this is not what fairness is about. Mrs. Thatcher worried about fairness, obviously from a conservative point of view, small c philosophical conservative point of view. For example, she thought that, as she put it, the government had no money. All the money the government had was taxpayers' money. It was money that private people had and that the government had was taking out of their pockets. And she thought that it was unjust that government should take any more of their money than was required to do those things that government alone could do well. And that, of course, is indeed a sense of justice. She was also outraged by the injustice which was represented by the power, the overweening power of the trade unions, and particularly, of course, the immunities that they enjoyed until Norman Tebbit stripped many of them away, and that they enjoyed, which really did put them above, as at least in Hayekian terms, they put them outside and above the rule of law. And taking another example, the poll tax. Now, the poll tax was not an unjust measure at all. It didn't work out very well. In fact, it worked out disastrously. And without that, I think that she would have remained in power. But the fact was, when she saw, and I can remember this very, very acutely, very, very clearly and personally, she was shocked when she found that people that she considered, she used to call them our people, but that she didn't just mean conservatives or something like that. She just meant the sort of people who really worked hard and tried to get on and were decent people, really. That they were suddenly being excessively penalised by this system. She was absolutely shocked. I remember she said, they wouldn't think it of me to do this. And that was her sense of justice. But the final, there are four cardinal virtues, that the final one is fortitude, which in good old English is really courage. She was an extraordinarily brave person. She was physically brave, morally brave, and intellectually brave. The Brighton bomb, if she had been in her bathroom a few moments earlier, she would have been killed, as the IRA wanted. She wasn't, but Dennis Thatcher was in his bedroom, not asleep, and with the sound of the masonry falling, and nobody knowing whether there were going to be new explosions or other horrors to come, she walked just straight into this darkened room to see whether he was all right. That takes guts. It takes guts when you're going to Northern Ireland, you know. going to Northern Ireland during the worst times of the Troubles and going to these outposts when anybody could have shot her by a lucky chance. But of course there's moral and physical courage too. It really does take courage to be prepared to be hated for doing what you know is right. Not many people are capable of that. I sometimes think it must be more difficult in some ways for a woman. But again, I can't tell, but I think it may be. And I think particularly when she was attacked over what we now think of rather amusingly, I suppose, as the Thatcher milk snatcher episode when she was Secretary of State for Education. This really hurt her, I think, because she was being accused of stopping poor little children gaining the sustenance that they needed in the classroom in order to grow up and be healthy. I think that is something which actually moves a woman much more than a man. But of course she had great courage too, not just in sending the fleet. It was quite easy to send the fleet to the Falklands. What was important was to ensure that it was used. Oh, the House of Commons was full of people who actually wanted to send it. Michael Foot wanted to send it, David Owen wanted to send it, everybody wanted to send it. But of course, when it actually came to using it, oh my goodness me, it would be easier, would it not, to have the fleet bobbing around in the worsening conditions around the Falklands, with our people sick and incapacitated in these ships, or while diplomacy, which of course diplomacy was the alternative, the only alternative that often hoped to the Argentinians, while diplomacy was practiced. It took a great deal of courage to say no. No. This is the ultimatum now. No. You have refused to answer the ultimatum. We go in. The Falklands could have been lost. They could very easily have been lost. And if one or two major ships had gone down, the cabinet would have thrown her out faster than they did in 1990. I remember some years later, when she actually was looking back in a rather rosy manner in the past, many years later actually, I said, well, what about the cabinet? I mean, were they with you? She said they were, let me get this right, she said, they were rock hard, she said, and then she looked at me afterwards. and of course the miners' strike too could easily have been lost. I mean, there were very good reasons why the Conservative governments had retreated before the miners, because they were incredibly powerful. And if Scargill had chosen to have his strike at a different time of year, if he'd been a little more reasonable, if he'd actually managed to strike up alliances within the trade union movement as a sensible person would have done, he could well have won. And there were two particular incidents that Norman Tebbit will remember well. I remember I was at the Home Office. Norman was at the DTI, I think. One was when there was a dock strike, and if that had continued, we would not have been able to sustain the pressure. And then there was when the extraordinarily named NACOD's men, who inspected the pits, and who alone were allowed to actually say whether it was safe for the miners to go down, when they went on strike. So these were 2 points at which it could all have been lost. But she persisted, she was shrewd, she wasn't just lucky, she was a good general, and she won those victories. Well, in my book I also deal with her downfall, and I don't pull any punches, partly because actually I think that it's very boring in life to pull punches, don't you? I mean, if you're going to have punches, we're going to say get in the punches. And also some people did really need to be punched. You know, the verdict of history, as Churchill said, he said he would ensure that the verdict of history was going to be as he wanted, because he was going to write the history. Well, I'm not in a position to write the history, but what is important is to understand that with, particularly Mrs. Thatcher's death, all sorts of people were very keen, and are very keen, to obscure their role in bringing her down. Now, perhaps in the end every leader falls and so on? Yes, fine, okay, there we are. But the consequences of it, not just for her, but the consequences for the country and the Conservative Party were truly catastrophic. And they were particularly catastrophic, I think, as regards the subject which is, I suppose, the one that is most in your minds most of the time, and that's Europe. Because, of course, in 1990, Mrs. Thatcher had perceived the truth. So she was an extremely honest person, but like other honest people, she made mistakes. And she and Keith Joseph were wrong in the 1970s to go along with the Heath U-turns and the extraordinarily harmful attempt to regulate every aspect of the economy, more comprehensive attempt at regulation of the economy than any socialist government in this country has ever produced. And they were wrong, they knew they were wrong, but of course they reacted in slightly different ways. Keith Joseph was always apologising about it. He would apologise for things that actually he had absolutely no reason to apologise at all for. But she didn't really do that. She used to get angry. And she would get angry partly with herself, but also angry with people who wanted to repeat these stupid mistakes. And I think that she had exactly the same feeling about Europe. See, she felt that she had been led by the nose over the Single European Act. Now, I think it's questionable whether that is so. I think the Single European Act, and I was at the Conservative Research Department at the time, and there exists no greater Eurosceptic than me, and I'm quoting John Major, in my case it happens to be true. But the fact is that I must say, I didn't actually see things quite in that way. So I'm not sure who really did. But the fact is that shortly after 1985, and the effects of the Single European Act were coming through, she really thought that she had done something that was leading Britain in completely the wrong direction. Hence, of course, the Bruges speech, hence indeed the Bruges Group. And I think that for the rest of her time, and particularly, of course, in 1990 she felt this, she was angry with herself and angry with those who just couldn't see that the fact that one had made some mistakes, when it had gone too far in losing sovereignty, when it had gone too far in accepting regulation, when it had gone too far, as she said in her speech, rolling forward bureaucracy, when we'd actually been removing bureaucracy and controls in Eastern Europe in 1989. So all of this sense, she really was willing and would, I'm sure, in 1990 have made a new start. We would certainly have vetoed the Maastricht Treaty. That is the point. You would have vetoed the Maastricht Treaty. And I do believe that if the Maastricht Treaty had been vetoed, we would never, ever be in the terrible situation that we are, both economically as regards Europe and politically in the Conservative Party. Well, so the last point I just want to make is about her legacy. Now, well, we know so much of this that I'm not going to go on and on and on. I suppose the first thing was that she really did succeed in reversing Britain's economic decline. That is what she wanted to do. She knew, she rightly diagnosed the causes of it: high inflation, excessive public spending, over-borrowing by the state, public sector monopolies, excessive trade union power, over-regulation generally. She knew what was wrong, and she put it right, step by step, year by year. It was extremely difficult at the beginning, and some mistakes were made, for example, in monetary policy, but it was completely new ground to be covering. And this was successful. This attempt to revive Britain's economy was successful. And there are two statistics which, if I don't read, I will get wrong. And since it comes from my own book, I think I've got every right to. And here they are. The first actually relates to GDP. The obvious measure of a country's economic performance is the growth of its GDP. Well, comparing cycle with cycle, economic cycle with cycle, which is the important thing, between 1973 and 79, Britain's GDP grew by less than 1% a year. But in the 1980s, with the Thatcher experiment, it grew by 2.25% a year. This was contrary to the international trend. The OECD countries did not show such a trend. And that contrast between us and their performance grew more marked after Mrs. Thatcher left, when the excessive inflation having got out of the system. And underlying this improved growth was higher productivity. I mean, the message that Keith Joseph and Mrs. Thatcher gave all the time, in opposition as well, was that you could only have high wages, you could only have wages at all, if you were actually producing goods at prices of the quality that people wanted to buy. There was no shortcut to this, so you had to be productive. And as regards productivity, taking a longer period, between the periods 1960 and 1973, it's legitimate to take these longer periods because productivity is difficult to measure. So that earlier period, comparing that with 1979 to 1994, Britain leapt from 12th to 5th place in the League of OECD nations on productivity. We leapt from 12th to 5th place. Now, those are statistics. Those are facts. They are accepted even by the left. The other aspect of the legacy, of course, is victory in the Cold War. Now, it was Reagan in the United States that masterminded the strategy which forced the USSR to abandon the attempt to win the Cold War, and indeed forced, in the end, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and finally, of course, in 1991 in the Soviet Union, and of the Soviet Union itself. But without Britain, Reagan, well, he might have done it. I'm not saying he couldn't have done it. But first of all, Britain's role would not have been enhanced, which gave us enormous influence during that period. And secondly, I think he would not have had the intellectual equipment to argue the case at meeting after meeting, summit after summit. Reagan was a very great man, but Mrs. Thatcher had a better mind. And these two things coming together, with, of course, the Falklands War, in other words, economic revival, plus military and security success, these restored the country's fortunes. This country's fortunes were restored to a state that they had not been in at any time since Suez. That is her achievement. But of course, what she did not succeed in doing was changing radically our relationship with what has become the European Union. I think she would have done that. She knew she was frustrated in her last years that she couldn't get people to do more, to oppose integration. Indeed, the Conservatives did not oppose integration. Maastricht furthered integration. And of course, under Blair, it went further, including as regards military integration. And now we are faced with the fact that we have to choose either to stay in this European Union and accept significant further losses of our own sovereignty and effectively abandon our own powers of self-government, or we have to get out. Now, Mrs. Thatcher had no doubt about what should be done. She said we must get out. And she was right. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Lord Tebbit of Chingford. I'm pleased to announce that Lord Tebbit has agreed to become President of the Bruges Group. In succession to Baroness Thatcher. Norman Tebbit first joined the Cabinet in 1981. As Secretary of State for Employment. At last we would have meaningful reform of labour relations. It was an occasion which marked the end of the predominance of Tory paternalists in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet and shadow cabinets, a situation which had prevailed for some 7 years. In 1981, Norman Tebbit addressed the Conservative Party conference and made a simple but effective speech which gave the Conservative Party a renewed sense of confidence. He also coined a phrase which is now used in common parlance across the globe: on your bike. After the 1983 general election, Lord Tebbit became Secretary of State for Trade and Industry. And although he subsequently became Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and party chairman, the terrorist attack on the Grand Hotel Brighton effectively curtailed his career and prevented him making an even higher contribution in his service to our country.
Yeah.
The terrorists chose their targets well, and in Airy Neve, Ian Gow and Norman Tebbit, they deprived Margaret Thatcher of 3 lieutenants whose skills counterbalanced her sometimes lack of awareness of the dangers from within her own party. Since leaving office some 25 years ago, Norman has remained the most effective voice for conservatism in this country. Successive occupants of number 10 Downing Street have had good reason to fear an intervention from the polecat. Ladies and gentlemen, Lord Tebbit of Chingford.
Ladies and gentlemen, delighted to see you all here, to know that there are still Conservatives abroad about the place. There was a time when I thought we would only be able to meet in safe houses. I want to talk really on 3 themes. What made Thatcher what she was, what she achieved, and why and where did she fail? And I want to start by saying how painful it was to me in the years even before I entered the House of Commons, travelling around the world, when so many people abroad would say, as you spoke to them in a bar or a bus somewhere, "Oh, you're British. How sad what has happened to your country." Come back to that at the end. What was it about Margaret Thatcher? Well, of course, she sprang from lower middle class, reasonably prosperous family, tradespeople, slightly below the salt. She came from a religious family, but of course nonconformist. She was not of the establishment. And as Robin said, she had courage. She had brains. She had scientific curiosity. She didn't just read science and then go to be a public relations consultant. She was a working scientist. For some people, religious belief and scientific knowledge are in conflict, somehow irreconcilable. Margaret Thatcher, practical as ever, always simply put them in separate boxes. Religion could contribute nothing to the design of soft ice cream, one of her great achievements in her scientific life. chemistry and science could contribute nothing to the debates on, for example, abortion, welfare, social security, or foreign policy. They were in separate boxes. But all discussions and all decision-making benefited from the scientific method. How often I recollect her saying, when a discussion was going off course early on, "Gentlemen, shall we have the facts first and the discussion afterwards?" But all the time, that discussion had to be illuminated by a deep sense of what was right and what was wrong. That was all a great advantage to me, particularly when I was party chairman. Because if I heard something on the news in the morning, I did not have to wonder how she would react. I knew how she would react because there was a firm framework of belief and understanding, and she would always react within that framework. That scientific approach led to a due process in consideration of government business. Let me illustrate that from my own experience. When she made me Secretary of State for Employment, my brief was to reform our industrial relations law. I had had a lot of thought about it. I tested my ideas on my officials. Imagine what it was like going into the Department of Employment in 1981. You know that all government departments exist because they represent an interest in government. The Department of Industry represented the CBI, the Defence Department represented the armed forces, the Foreign Office represented foreigners, and still does. The Department of Employment thought that it represented the TUC. I had to disabuse them of that idea. Once I had done that, and it didn't take very long for them to understand what I was about, I could not have had a better, more loyal and constructive bunch of men and women working for me. My employment legislation has stood the test of the years. Whenever it has gone to court, it has worked exactly as we envisaged. It has not been reformed or changed. The credit for much of that goes to my civil servants who put the flesh on the bones of what I wanted to do. And I wish some of Her Majesty's ministers these days would just take the trouble to understand how to make the civil service work for you, instead of bellyaching that it doesn't. I had to go to the Prime Minister and convince her of what I wanted to do. And I told her that central to my proposition, to my intentions, was that we had got the wrong end of the stick about the problem of industrial relations. I had to tell her that the guys on the shop floor were not mad keen to be out on strike every week. They got help from their wives, hanging around the house, doing nothing and not bringing in any money. It took a long time to make up what they had lost in wages in the strike through the gains that they had achieved. The villains in the piece, and some of them we now know were villains in the pocket of the Soviet Union, were the trades union leaders. They were very mighty folk. They walked about in number 10, they strutted. There was never a programme on the BBC, a brains trust, or in any questions where there was not a trades union to represent the interest of the trades unions. They had a view on nuclear weapons. They had a view on everything. It wasn't necessarily the view of their members. And I told Margaret Thatcher that these were not moderate men, just holding these Bolshevik workers in check. They, the cloth cap colonels, were the cause of the problem, and we should go at them and give the union members control over their own unions again, with proper balloting procedures. She thought about it for a while. She said, Norman, what if you're wrong? And I said, then we're all done for. Having convinced her, I then had to go back to my department to write a paper for the cabinet. It went to a cabinet committee. It was clawed all over by my colleagues with the advice of their officials. From that, a paper to the cabinet. There I saw another side of Margaret Thatcher. There was a deep discussion about it. I have to tell you, I did not have the unanimous support of my colleagues. In fact, I grew more and more depressed as I, like the cabinet secretary, counting up the voices. At the end of it, she smiled a sweet smile which you could put on and said, "Well, gentlemen, it's clear that the Secretary of State for Employment has the support of the Cabinet to go ahead with his white paper." I was not the only one that was pretty darn surprised. And we then went on through that process, and that's what led to getting it right. I saw the careers of ministers wrecked by inept, inadequate presentations to the Cabinet and meeting her wrath. So what did she achieve? When she came to office, it was after the winter of discontent. It was the culmination of a series of challenges by the trades union leadership to the authority of Parliament. We had vast overmanning, restrictive practices, destroying industry. We had nationalised industries which did not create wealth, they actually consumed wealth. They used more money than they produced goods and services, regularly, year in and year out. The cloth cap colonels were constantly arriving in Downing Street to present their demands. Jim Callaghan's brave, but perhaps forlorn resistance had been overcome in the winter of discontent. Jim Callaghan was the second Prime Minister to be turned out of office by industrial action. She sorted the trades union leaders. She sorted Scargill's strike, which was designed to sweep her out of office. And in doing so, she saved democracy. She sorted the nationalised industries. Can you imagine what it would be like trying to get a telephone line if we were still dependent upon the post office nationalised monopoly telephone service? Don't speak of it. Some of you will remember the days when the party line was not what you had to vote for. There was a telephone number you shared with your neighbours because you rationed telephones instead of selling them. She sorted the Argentinians. I've seen many times those on the left saying how lucky she was that the Argentinians invaded the Falklands because it saved her premiership. I have to tell you, that Friday morning in the Cabinet, when it was confirmed that they had landed on the Falkland Islands, it didn't seem very lucky to any of us. With President Reagan, she ended the Cold War. the Berlin Wall came down. The Warsaw Pact collapsed. The NATO Pact carried on. I doubt that any other potential leader that I've known in my time could have achieved all that. But then, what did she not do? I don't think we sufficiently reformed education, although Ken Baker tried very hard. We did not reform welfare. We did not tackle the incipient problems of the NHS. And of course, we, both she and I, trod a tortuous path of understanding that the ambitions of the European Union and the ambitions of the British people to be a free, self-governing country were incompatible. Why didn't we achieve more? Why didn't we deal with some of those problems? In my experience, in a cabinet of 20 or so men and women, there is unlikely to be more than half a dozen real drivers, radicals, who can also get things done. A Prime Minister has to deploy those men and women where the problem is most urgent. That is what she did. Others were great men. Keith Joseph, for example, a man I greatly admired and loved. But Keith was not a driver. He was a thinker, but not a driver. Then, of course, there is timing. I don't think that in her time as Prime Minister, the country was ready for any sort of real showdown, any real radical reform of the health service. I tried to persuade her to open the way to it in the 1987 manifesto. She said no, it was too early. I don't think the country was quite ready for welfare reform in the way that Ian Duncan Smith and Frank Field were advocating in those days. Then did she have her faults? Yes, of course she did. Robin Harris just now implied, or said even Robin, that she was not a terribly good judge of people. I think that was true. She could sometimes succumb to flattery. She gave house room to a low-grade creature like Woodrow Wyatt. She did not convert what must have been worries about Jimmy Savile into a move to get away from him. She was too lenient with, for example, my dear old friend Peter Morrison, whom I liked enormously, but was not an effective PPS. I think they were real problems for her. Then I ask myself very often, perhaps in that extraordinary way in our Constitution, in all that it embraces, there is a sort of rule, a natural law, that no Prime Minister can remain in office for much more than 10 years. I think there are two aspects to that. One is that when the Prime Minister first goes into number 10 and turns and looks back out of the windows are big. Every year he or she is in office, the windows get smaller. They see less of the outside world. And then in terms of management of Parliament and the House of Commons, the party, every year There are more backbenchers ambitious for office who are disappointed. There are more who have held office but not quite made the grade, who are dropped and are disappointed. She is beginning, or he, to lose friends, to become vulnerable. For all that, let us just look, lastly, at the statistics, the numbers, the facts. At her first election victory, she polled 13.7 million votes. At her second, 13 million. At her third, after 8 years in office, good times and bad, 13.8 million. Just a few more. Contrast that with the man so admired as the master politician of our times, Tony Blair. At his first election victory, he scored 13.5 million. At his second, when the electors knew him a bit better, he scored 10.7 million. At his third, when they were really beginning to understand the man, he scored 9.5 million. He lost 4 million of his original voters. Margaret kept them all. That is the difference as politicians. And lastly, let me come back to what I said about my early days. When people abroad would say to you, with that sadness, "Oh, you're British. It's so sad what's happened to your country." I found as a minister I was going around, and my colleagues in other governments were saying, "Oh, if only we had a Thatcher." They were following our example. They were privatising their telcos and things of that kind across the world. But it was only when I was in Italy that I realised the full impact of it. It was when an Italian said to me, "If only we had a Margaret Thatcher." I suddenly thought, what would an Italian Margaret Thatcher? Verdi would have written an opera for her. And I wonder who would have been able to take that part. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And can we start with some questions, please? Yes, the lady in front.
You inspired me as a very young teenager in 1979 and Margaret Thatcher, and I joined the Conservative Party. Then, a few years ago, I decided I wanted to be a Tory MP. So I came and had a cup of tea with you in the House of Lords, and you said to me, "Janice, turn your back to everybody, because if the Cameroons see you in here, you're finished." I wasn't quite, because I did go on to fight the general election for the Tories. And then the modern Conservative Party left me, and now I've joined UKIP. Now, I'm hoping to get elected and represent us in Brussels to Brexit next year. Now, if we do, and as it's expected, and Number 10 expect this as well, that we top the polls next year, do you think Mr Cameron will change his course?
I don't know what's going to happen next year. UKIP has picked up an enormous number of supporters, not solely about the European issue, but because across a much broader front, it is saying things which I hear said in the markets, in the pubs, all over the place, more broadly. And we have not been very kind in the Conservative Party. Sorry, we've not been very kind in the Conservative Party to our grassroots supporters. It may be that UKIP comes top of the poll next year, but we won't know what that means other than it is sending a message to Mr. Cameron and the government. I don't think that that would precipitate change in the Conservative Party's leadership at that stage. That's my guess. I think that there are many Tories who will vote UKIP at those elections, and then faced with that question, is it going to be Miliband or is it going to be Cameron, Conservatives? They will go back to Cameron. But I don't know that, because there may be other events between now and then. The euro could go bust. Things like that which could affect it. I just don't know.
Lord Tebbit, it's nice to confront you. I have seen you many times at the Conservative Party with yourself and Margaret Thatcher. It was great. You still look that young and energetic that you used to look at Blackpool and other party conferences. So congratulations on your good health. Right. My question. You were a very powerful Conservative politician. You had the ear of Margaret Thatcher. Now both you and Dr. Harris have hinted that she was not happy with Europe. My question to you is, if she did not fall in 1990, do you think she would have taken Britain out of Europe?
Again, I don't know, but I think she would not have gone along with the Maastricht Treaty. That was the one which made it plain that the words in the treaties, ever closer union, did not merely mean that we would feel very strongly that we were all Europeans standing together, but that we were going to be governed centrally. And of course, the creation of the European single currency, the euro, requires a single government. Because as I explained to Ken Clark many, many, many years ago, no currency can have more than one Chancellor of the Exchequer. That's the problem of the euro. So again, I'm pretty sure she wouldn't have gone down the Maastricht route. She and I tried everything we could to get all we could out of the European Union. The Single European Act, which is much quoted, should actually have been called the Single European Market Act, and brought us a good many benefits, should have brought us more. The problems arose, other problems arose, particularly with the expansion of Europe. But I think she might have done. But the party would have taken a bit of pulling along at that time.
I'm sure Norman is right. The papers do exist, so it isn't just a matter of my speculating. I mean, it's clear that the exchanges, for example, between her and John Major, she was insisting that we veto what turned out to be the Maastricht Treaty. And now, I think that once it had occurred that they had gone ahead with their moves under a separate treaty, that would have been the beginning of some divergence of ways. You know, that's how it would have been, but it would have been a much easier way to have the ways diverge than, unfortunately, what has got to be done now. But I'm sure that she would have done that. That was a really fundamental disagreement between her and John Major.
Thank you.
Lord Tebbit, a couple of years ago, I had the misfortune to run into Bob Crow in the local pub. And I went up to him. I went up to him and I said, if Margaret Thatcher was still in power, she would have got rid of you in the same way that she did with Ken Livingstone and Arthur Scargill, which wasn't met with a very kind response. If Margaret Thatcher was still in power, how would she deal with Bob Crow, and how long would it have taken her to get rid of him?
I think that you have to look at what the atmosphere would have been and how Mr. Crow's members would be feeling about their jobs and their prospects and everything else. He doesn't find it easy to get a majority of his members to vote for his strikes. He postures about a great deal and achieves quite a lot for them without taking them out on strike in any way which would lose them money. And he's been a pretty good tactician in that way. I think you need, first of all, a better tactician to deal with him, and secondly, against a different background. Remember that there are members of Bob Crow's union who are not that well paid. They are probably amongst those who support our welfare reforms. There are a lot of them who are pretty well paid, but still can't afford these days to buy their own homes. That was another one of her achievements, the expansion of home ownership. So it might be that you have to deal with some of those other problems to make it possible for Bob Crow's members to see that their interest is not silly industrial relations strife, but in serving the travelling public properly in London.
Thank you. Gentleman on the second row back there. Yes. Yes, you, sir. Sorry.
Thank you.
By the way, sorry, could I just come back with something? On that question, at the end of the day, we should remember what President Reagan did when the American air traffic controllers went out on strike. He'd had enough, he sacked them and replaced them. Driving an underground train is not the highest skilled job in the land. And Bob Crow's members might have to be subtly reminded of it.
Lord Tebbit, as you know, when Michael Heseltine stood against Mrs. Thatcher for the leadership, Mrs. Thatcher actually got more votes, but were 2 or 3 votes short of the margin required. Do you think that in any way she could have been persuaded, or has she been persuaded to put her name forward for that second round, she would have won again?
I think she might have done, but when the margin is as narrow as that, when so many people have come out against her as that, and when she saw members of the cabinet one after the other, and they told her in some way or another that they would not back her, she knew that the game was basically over. Of course, it was a terrible mistake to see them one by one. I would have advised her to call a cabinet and look round the table and say, well, gentlemen, who is going to back me and who will not? Secretary of State for, and she would have probably started with someone like Cecil Parkinson. Yes, Margaret. Yes, Prime Minister, I'll back you. One after the other, as she went along the row, picking them off, the most positive to her first, until she got 3 or 4 left isolated. it would have been a much better tactic for dealing with it. But once it was clear that the cabinet was not pretty united in supporting her, that was it.
Robin, you
Yeah,
were in number 10
well,
at that time.
Yes.
What are your thoughts?
Well, I'll distinguish between my thoughts at the time and my thoughts now. My thoughts at the time were, I thought the whole thing was just appalling. Actually just sort of morally disgusting and appalling and so on. So my reaction when this comes, and also she was very hurt by this. She was suffering. And if you are fond of somebody, you want the suffering to end. My father was buried on Thursday. And it's true also that when you see somebody who is close to you suffering, you want the suffering to end. But often actually we want the suffering to end, we think that we want the suffering to end for their benefit. But it's actually often for ours. Because actually, and I now think that she would have been better off herself, and the country would have been better off if she put her name forward for a second round. And either won, I think she could have just won actually with a decent campaign, or even just lost, I mean, I think it would have been better that it was clear. Because the way that it all happened was that, well, first of all, I do believe that John Major was an extremely inadequate Prime Minister. And I regret that my fellow speaker wasn't, though I don't think my fellow speaker would have won, actually. But I regret that my fellow speaker here was not actually able to stand with that election. I think, again, it would be better if Norman, something like, well, actually, Norman actually had won and lost. Again, I'm somebody who believes that clarity in politics has a lot to be said for it. And so I do think that all things considered, I think she should have stood. One of the reasons she didn't, I mean, Baroness Thatcher was against her doing it. And again, of course, he felt for her. But she really wasn't able to live an ordinary life, having spent all that time in Downing Street and all that time in politics. I mean, she hated being out of office. Again, one just has to try to understand something like that. And even I, at the time, I don't think fully understood that. I thought that most people, after all, she was healthy and intelligent, and one would think that somebody could actually go off and do something else anyway. But actually, her whole heart and mind were just into this one thing that she knew she could do, which was leadership. She was made for leadership. And I'm afraid that after losing office, she did, in my view, make substantial contributions of one sort or another, but only under very sad circumstances, and circumstances that were bad for her and bad for the country. Now, the whole thing was an absolute unmitigated disaster.
I remember saying of my own departure from office, it's probably better to go while they're asking you to stay than to stay while they're asking you to go. Perhaps I was lucky in that sense that they never found me out.
I think also it left a terrible legacy within the parliamentary party. When I got elected in 1992, it was like something terrible that happened in the family that nobody talked about. And John Major was never an effective leader. Many MPs had voted for John Major because of the circumstances of Margaret Thatcher's fall, but he was never an effective leader, and he lost respect amongst the parliamentary party. And what some MPs misguidedly attempted to do in 1990 by removing Margaret and thinking this was an electoral salvation, it was indeed an electoral disaster. We scraped home in 92, but the day of reckoning came in 97.
Well, perhaps John Major colluded against his cabinet. I don't like to be bitching about I sometimes overcome my reluctance. But I fear John was far too easily influenced by people who told him how good he was at his job. And they were particularly the Foreign Office mob. And I'm afraid I supported him because I did not want Heseltine. I thought that would have torn the party apart.
Yeah.
And for a while I saw him quite frequently in number 10. And then we were talking about the single currency. And I told him that we must, under no circumstances, join the single currency. And he said, oh, but it's only a technical matter. It's not a matter of principle. I don't think I spoke to him again after that.
Can I have the question from Sam Swirling?
Could I ask Robin Harris? I've read your wonderful book. I recall Harold Wilson saying in February 1966 that the seamen's strike was being motivated by a, quote, tightly knit group of politically motivated men working out of 16 King Street, the headquarters of the Communist Party under the leadership of Bert Ramsden. And the reason I raised that is that I always thought the Conservative Party was very, very slow, despite the advice from the Economic League, Common Cause, East-West Digest, Industrial Research and Information Services, and many other organisations pointing this out. So historically, why was it that so much industrial unrest, I mean, remember the ETU, Frank Fuchs, and the other people involved in that doing the ballot rigging, why has it been, looking back over 60 years, and Margaret Thatcher inherited some of this, though not a great deal, but some of it, the Conservative Party has been so slow when there was a great opportunity to quash the left influence in British life by demanding earlier than it happened the proscription of communist front organisations like the British Peace Committee, Soviet Friendship Society, Society of Anglo-Chinese Understanding.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
But one or two other points you made, I'm not sure it's completely true, of course, what you say about the Soviet front organisations. Absolutely true. Norman was actually alluding, of course, to Jack Jones, actually, but to Jack Jones, we now know, was receiving funds from the KGB, well, from the Soviet Union, whether through the KGB or what it was, I don't know. And I mean, this is well known. And there was a lot of that. Now, on the other, where I would have some doubt is whether proscription of organisations is actually a very good way of dealing with these things. I think we need to know who our enemies are. We don't necessarily have to legislate for them no longer to be active. And we found all of this, of course, in dealing with the IRA. I mean, you proscribe an organisation and they all just they regroup under another heading.
It's the Labour Party who prescribed them.
Oh well, but that was within. That was actually within the Labour Party itself. I thought you were talking about proscription as a legal question as to whether something was an unlawful organisation. What was done, you're quite right, in the Labour Party was that it was incompatible with being a member of the Labour Party to be a member of certain of these organisations. Well, I think that was something that the Labour Party could do. But I do just want to make one point, and that is Syria. If this foolish government involves us in Syria, it will be the most wanton disaster that is our foreign policy. Absurd, knowing what happened in Iraq, where actually, at least the West, America and its allies, us, we did at least have control over events. We were at least able, one would have thought, on the ground to try to reshape things as we wanted, but in fact, we didn't. The outcomes were not what we wanted, and so in fact the place is in chaos. But in Syria, the effect of backing the opposition will be the extinction, elimination, and large-scale murder, incidentally, of well over 2 million Christians in the area as well. And it's absolutely phenomenal that this great Christian Prime Minister cannot be bothered to try to take note of that.
I saw it reported the other day. The gentleman described as Mr. Haig's Chief of Staff is a Bosnian Muslim. It would seem to be quite extraordinary that in the Foreign Office, which is after all supposed, despite my jests, to project Britain's interests across the world, that you should have somebody foreign-born and of a minority religion, which is acutely difficult for us to handle in that part of the world. That would seem to be very odd.
What you say is to accept that it's a woman, but what you've said
It's a woman.
Yes, but what you're saying is so
Extraordinary.
How did the special relationship in Thatcher-Reagan days compare, particularly British influence within the special relationship, compare then to with Blair Bush and the situation today?
Robin?
I think you've actually written a book on it.
I did write something some time ago on that. But I think the thing is that the Thatcher-Reagan relationship was really quite odd, because it really was a friendship. And I think Enoch Powell once said that either there are few or no friendships in politics or something. But no doubt he was talking about domestic politics. But actually real friendships, particularly real friendships between the leaders of different countries, is really very unusual. And that they liked one another and they actually saw things in the same light. It wasn't put on, you know. And so it was quite a unique thing, that's what I'm saying. And now, of course, we have this absurd thing where leaders are meant to be great friends. And do you remember when, I think it was George W. Bush who said he looked into Putin's eyes and had seen that he was a Democrat? whether the Litvinenko family would actually agree, I'm not too sure. But it was a good relationship. Britain was very much the junior partner, and Mrs. Thatcher recognised that. She tried to influence America, but mainly actually getting Reagan to think through what he wanted to do more clearly. So, for example, ballistic missile defence, which Reagan was inclined to look at in a rather utopian manner as a means of freeing the world from nuclear missiles altogether, which he quite rightly thought was an extremely dangerous concept, because in fact, she said, nuclear missiles nuclear technology can never be disinvented. Again, it's also a scientific understanding that somebody somewhere will have a nuclear missile. And the idea that you're going to reach some point where actually missiles and nuclear weapons can just be eliminated, as Reagan wanted at Reykjavik, that was impractical. I should also say that she always, sometimes for good and sometimes I think mistakenly, as over the Grenada row, she also was very vigorous in her disagreement with Reagan when she thought that he was not taking proper respect, showing proper respect for British interests. But it was a good relationship, and it was different particularly from the relationship between Blair and Bush, because she was always questioning. She knew that in the end she couldn't dictate what the Americans were going to do. Anybody who thinks you could dictate what the Americans do is a fool. She understood that, but she also wanted them to think through everything that they were doing. For example, before the Libyan raid in 1986, very, very dangerous time for her politically, because so soon after Western. She was saying, the messages were going out, are you sure that you can pinpoint the targets, that they're going to be the right targets? And of course, the Americans got some of them wrong. They often do. Great powers do. But anyway, she was doing that all the time. Now, it is quite clear that Blair did not cross-question Bush. It's quite clear he did not press the Americans to think what would actually happen after the invasion and the overthrow of Saddam. And in particular, he completely misunderstood the whole question of the reality or lack of reality of weapons of mass destruction. I believe that Blair's, I don't think it was mendacity, I think it was wishful thinking and lack of intellectual engagement. And Mrs. Thatcher was never guilty of either wishful thinking or lack of intellectual engagement when it came to making the special relationship work.
Next question, lady towards the window.
At the risk of not being very popular with everybody, I'm afraid I feel that David Cameron has a lot to deal with that we don't hear about behind the doors within the coalition government, and his hands are tied in a lot of respects, I feel. I just wondered how Margaret Thatcher, I know she had a good majority, would have dealt with a situation where she had to appease a liberal.
Norman?
I don't think Margaret Thatcher would have seen it possible to be in a coalition. It was Cecil Parkinson's business as chairman and mine as chairman to make sure that did not arise. And I think that, so it was our business to make sure that the position did not arise where she might be forced into coalition. I think that one of the big worries for me about coalition is the way it's operated, with decisions being reached by the Quad, a sort of slightly larger extension of Mr. Blair's sofa, instead of being reached through proper process in Cabinet. And so often, therefore, things come out half-baked, poorly thought through, and the legislation is defective and simply doesn't work terribly well. That's a characteristic of coalition, unless there is a single overriding purpose, as in the wartime coalition.
Yeah. Thank you. Right, I'll try again. Gentleman near the window. Yes.
First of all, I have raised this in the past and actually got surprising support for it from no less than a Labour MP. Mrs. Thatcher had a lot to deal with, there's no two ways about that. And indeed, she perhaps didn't have the great opportunity, apart from the really big picture, which was the Cold War and what have you, to look at just our general overseas policy. The recent support I've had is, as we move forward and looking forward, with the ideals of either the Bruges Group or perhaps yourselves, is that we've still got a bit of legacy left from the good old days. And we need to look forward to the future. Did Mrs. Thatcher have the time, and I do mean the time, given the difficulty she had, to think of, was there any importance for the Commonwealth? Because it seems to be raising its head slowly but surely as the possible vote on whether we have an in or out to do with Europe. I noticed in tonight's newspaper that the Victoria Falls were lit in blue at the birth of the royal baby. Perhaps not the most important thing in government or diplomacy or what have you, but it's a nice thing to do. But it appears to be happening all over the Commonwealth. And unfortunately for Europe, we have perhaps lost a lot of respect for the Commonwealth. But looking forward, did she have some understanding of what Europe and signing up to Europe meant, saying goodbye? Or was it something which was, unfortunately, something which couldn't be dealt with at that moment in our time?
Thank you.
I think you have to look back. First of all, the countries of the Commonwealth were in a pretty poor condition, many of them, at that time. and a number of them remain in pretty poor condition today. Most noteworthy, of course, has been the enormous success of India in maintaining, despite all its difficulties, a reasonably democratic and open form of government and economic success. I think that has been quite outstanding. But if you look at the rest of Africa, it's a bit difficult to see how, looking at it then, you could have envisaged the advantages of trading with most of Africa as compared with trading with our European friends. It was disproportionate. We also, probably because of the Cold War, had to have a complete fixation, if you like, with the American allies and with the other NATO allies. So I think it was quite understandable. I think there is more of a case now for the development of the Commonwealth than there was a few years ago. Much of Africa is still pretty near basket case, but on the other hand, India is going pretty well still. And of course, we've still got Australia and New Zealand doing remarkably well. And lots of the smaller parts where they have been quite successful in recent years in maintaining reasonably decent government. So I think it was natural.
Yeah, I just add to that that while she was in office, the huge row continuing year after year was about South Africa.
Yes.
And South Africa, there was once you the Commonwealth was just actually really the main meetings were just a talking shop for all these people to sound off against racism and so on. And really there was no possibility of getting a common view about anything very useful in the Commonwealth. That only changed when the big changes took place, which of course she was supporting these changes, and indeed was helpful in getting Mandela free. But that took place right at the end of her time in office.
You'll remember, Robin, I think it's true, that at one of the conferences in Africa somewhere, the power failed for about the third or fourth time while the Thatchers were getting ready for the big dinner. And I think it was on the third or fourth occasion that Dennis, in his usual incisive way, observed to Margaret, the buggeration factor's pretty high around here.
Right. I'll take a final question from I'll take it from the gentleman on that side. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I think we're all grateful to our two speakers for addresses which were both expert and eloquent, and also to you, sir, Mr. Chairman, for your remarks on K&O. But here we look to the future, and as Lord Tebbit has rightly reminded us, one of the big problems is the long-term decline in the number of voters, total voters, voting for especially the Conservative Party, but actually both the major parties. And there are now questions being asked about whether there are flaws, structural flaws in our system of government, and whether there are indeed limited, moderate steps that are within the realm of possibility which it might be possible to take to remedy these without challenging or undermining parliamentary democracy. And I wonder whether, in particular, our two speakers think there is any scope for introducing, institutionalizing a limited use of non-binding referenda to be triggered, to be awarded not by the Prime Minister, but triggered by popular demand from the electorate. This can easily be delivered by electronic means these days. It would not supersede Parliament, but it might have an interesting effect in focusing the minds of parliamentarians on popular opinion in the country. Would this have commended itself to Margaret Thatcher? Does it commend itself to people of your experience today?
Let me jump in by saying this, first of all. that when things are not going very well, there seems to be a terrific temptation to look at the structure. But so often, the structure has worked perfectly well for a long time. And the first thing to look at, in my judgment, is whether the people who are using the structure are up to it. I don't think there's much wrong with our structure. Obviously, the shenanigans with the Liberals preventing redistribution to even the constituencies is a very big issue. But that's not really about structure. I'm uneasy about all these referenda because it is very easy to get two referenda, one succeeding the other, which are simply incompatible. They're just, yes, people will say to that proposition, and yes to that proposition, but they're incompatible. What do you do then? It's a nonsense. No, I think that what has happened recently is that the politicians have got it wrong. Let me illustrate what I mean. We're told that to win an election, a party has to stand on the centre ground. Well, I'm actually on Robin's left on this occasion. But let's suppose I want to get onto the centre ground between me and Robin. I move towards him. Where is the centre now? It's there. Ah, but we've got to be on the centre ground. I will move towards him again. Before very long, I'm sitting on his lap. And all my supporters are out there with nowhere to go except to...
UKIP.
If it was the Labour Party that was moving away from its supporters to the BNP or something of that kind. No, there is a different way to look at this thing. And that is, you say, where is the common ground? One of the things which has annoyed me is how long it's taken for people to realise that welfare reform matters not so much to the guy who lives in a house with a big gravel drive and 2 Volvos and 3 au pairs for the children and things of that kind. It really matters to the bloke that drives a lorry or a bus and works damned hard and doesn't take home much money, but comes home every night to see his neighbour still sitting in the garden reading the Racing Times, having not done a day's work for years and living as well as him. And you can exploit common ground and get people across to vote for you, even although they don't buy everything that you're saying. There were a lot of people we found in surveys that we did, and I must say we didn't do nearly as many in my day as they do there nowadays, who would say of Margaret Thatcher, don't agree with her all the time, but she knows where she's going and she knows what she wants to do, and I'll back her. You don't get people to back you by asking them what to do. You get people to back you by saying what you want to do and persuading them that it's right. Yes, you listen to them, but you don't let them tell you. That's the secret of leadership, and it's something we've lost in recent years.
This has really been a unique occasion, and we are indeed grateful to us, two speakers, for sharing their experiences of Margaret Thatcher and her period in government, and the insights that they gained from that period, and how they apply today. I'd also like to remind you that Robin Harris's book, Not for Turning, is available outside in the bookstore. I hope you'll be taking advantage of that excellent work.
Yeah.
The next meeting of the Bruges Group is in fact at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester at 2 o'clock on Monday the 30th of September. We have 3 speakers for that occasion. We have William Cash MP, Peter Oborne of the Daily Telegraph, and Nigel Farage of the UK. I'm told that this may be the biggest meeting of the party conference, and
Including in the hall.
including, we are not having it in the hall. That could be a little embarrassing. We are having it in the town hall, so there will be plenty of room. I think there will be hundreds there, and it will be well attended by the media. So if any of you would like to avail yourself of a day return to Manchester, the prices are probably fairly cheap at this stage. I think you can be assured of another first-class meeting, and the subject for discussion is the Conservatives and UKIP, enemies or allies. So your contribution and attendance will be most welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, can I thank these 2 excellent speakers for everything they have done.